Hello there. Let's talk about distortion. As one of the biggest parts of the Project Moon world, there's a lot of discussion on the topic, a lot of theories, and a lot of straight-up misinformation. Originally, this video was going to be more of a video essay, with me covering some common misunderstandings I've seen across the community. But that script came off a lot more aggressive than I wanted. Plus, I was essentially arguing against strawmen rather than responding to specific arguments. So instead, I asked my viewers what they thought of distortions. Things they've heard that they either believe or disbelieve, or just wanted to be talked about. I'm going to either corroborate those ideas with evidence, or disprove them with more evidence. Of course, I'm mostly relying on my memory of notable passages in Project Moon media. I didn't scour the entirety of the games and web novels before making this video, so if I get something wrong, or you simply disagree with my interpretations, let me know. Before we get started, let's cover some ideas I want to set as groundwork. First off, I want to note that I believe the community's perception of distortion is skewed by the fact that most people only play the games, not supplementary media like Distortion Detective. By the nature of the games being combat-oriented, this is going to lead to a bias of most distortions we see being important people who turn into monstrous combat-oriented forms during dramatic moments. In comparison, distortions seen in Distortion Detective are ordinary people, often made into far more abstract and bizarre forms with esoteric powers, and their transformation is shown to generally be far more gradual and almost mundane. Distortion Detective in general is a very interesting source that goes deeper than the games ever really do, giving us a boots-on-the-ground perspective we don't get to see during dramatic story moments. Okay, let's get into your comments on what you want me to talk about. First off, Hator Dragon says that the idea of fully manifested ego making you immune to distortion is mostly a misconception, and that it's only a theory of Moses that gets passed around as fact. I agree, mostly, but what needs to be understood is that ego and distortions are the same thing. A distortion is what happens when you allow your ego to consume you, and ego equipment, aka psychoment, is what happens when you shape your ego into a usable form. If a person has manifested ego, and their ego becomes unstable, presumably through something like questioning the beliefs that composed the ego in the first place, then their ego will go back to a more primordial, fluid state, and allowed to be able to turn into a distorted form. That's my thoughts, anyway, based on how we've seen ego and distortion structured. I'll probably do another video like this, but on ego, so we'll leave it at that, and I'll research the topic more in the meantime. Roland Gaming says that they believe Carmen doesn't act with any sort of intention, and instead just yes-ands your most prominent thoughts. They continue by saying that the reverb ensemble isn't really helped by Carmen, and that instead it's just Argalia's thoughts and desires being repeated over and over. The first part is pretty much true. Carmen has no issue affirming terrible beliefs, regardless of if they contradict her own original beliefs, or the beliefs she repeats for others. She wants everyone to live their truth, even if it results in conflict and suffering for others. However, to say that she has no involvement in the reverb ensemble's actions doesn't feel quite true. Carmen still has her own desires. She wants people to distort. She specifically calls out ego as being unneeded suffering. She has goals and manipulates the events of Ruina in very intentional ways. As we see with Alan Gregor, she's willing to use the library's invitations on a whim, simply to get the result she wants. I see no reason for her not to be doing the same with the ensemble. Argalia doesn't even distort until it's the proper time. That alone shows some kind of intent, as if the ensemble really was just purely the result of Argalia spiraling, I feel like he would have distorted off the bat. I get where you're coming from with this one, but I don't think it really works narratively. Carmen's just too important to say it was all just her echoing everyone else's thoughts, rather than her having her own agency. Rise Comics Collective brings up the sort of type of distortion that the ensemble is composed of. These sort of high-functioning distortions that are able to sort of live normal-ish lives and appear very human. Pryor, friend of the channel, adds on to this, saying that while these distortions appear stable, they're still wrought with uncontrolled emotions. Yeah, distortions are ultimately the result of an intentional lack of control over your emotions. So, while some distortions are still perfectly in control of their thoughts and actions, their inner emotions are just as crazy as any other distortion, and cannot truly live as a normal human, even if they appear fine. Another thing Pryor mentioned is the idea of focusing on sins specifically, and that distortion is a focus on embracing sins rather than overcoming them. I agree to a degree. Regular checkup proves that distortion does have a focus on sin, and even before that, Moses talks about common themes that line up with the sins we know. Despair has an association with water. Neurosis has an association with electricity. These are common themes that pop up in many distortions. I do have a disagreement with two things Pryor mentions. The idea that distortion is specifically an embracing of the sin doesn't quite work when ego is often shown as being an embracing of one's sins and the pain they cause others. Also, comparing distortion to the sickness of the mind doesn't quite feel right either, since it's more of Carmen's cure to that sickness of the mind, which seems to be a lack of individual agency that's so prevalent in the city. Now, MH Mega takes issue with the common interpretation of distortion as a mental breakdown, and instead narrows it down to the shattering of a commonly held belief. I'm sorry to say, but this was the original argument that made me want to make this video in the first place, as this is very provably wrong, and stems from the issues with the combat-focused structure of the games that I talked about earlier. First off, let's address the in-game distortions that don't follow this theory, so I can show that while this concept may stem from patterns brought about by gameplay structure, it still relies on excluding key characters to fit this narrative. Cromer could be considered to have her worldview of Sinclair shattered by him refusing to join her, but overall, she seems pretty unshattered. In fact, her distortion feels more like her worldview being overwhelming rather than destroyed. Papa Bongi distorts because of the anguish of losing his chicken restaurant. Yeah, it's a big change, but it's not a worldview. His life just went down the shitter. Philip was distorted by Oswald showing him illusions which reaffirmed his darkest thoughts. Greta, while we don't know her exact reasons, seems to be just a continuation of her role as a great chef. The biggest ones, though, come from the novels. In Leviathan, Jumsoon distorts after pure bliss from seeing himself win in every mirror world. When he is actually challenged on his beliefs, that's when something else happens that I'll get to later. In Distortion Detective, we see one pretty good instance and are told another good instance. We see the mock exam, a mass distortion caused by the overwhelming pressure of the upcoming exams. No worldview shattered, just overwhelming mental anguish of many, many students. We are also told about the balloon-headed people. a form of reoccurring distortion in which people in the service industry had the stress literally inflate their heads like a balloon until it violently popped. Again, no worldview, no ideology, just the stress of an ordinary life. It seems that this community is way too eager to look at patterns and declare them to be rules. You see this in many communities, really, especially something that has a power system like, say, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. People take common traits and try to apply the logic to every single instance, rather than use them as guidelines. Is having your worldview challenged a very reliable way to distort? Yes, absolutely, and it's very narratively satisfying too. But you can't discount the very clear instances of that not being the case. Distortion is exactly as it says on the tin. It's a corruption of a person's sense of self, and to try and limit that exploration of the self that the series' narrative is known for is a pretty poor decision. Yes, distortion is just a mental breakdown. Simple as that. There's so many different ways it can happen, even ones that we haven't seen yet. So please, stop trying to discredit creativity in the name of rules. This is a story, let it not always make sense. If you see someone try to perpetuate this myth, please politely correct them by giving them some of the examples above, and any others that you can think of. Okay, back to shorter, simpler answers. Let's do a couple of opinions in succession. Demar Gar takes issues with the depiction of Carmen as an antichrist or devil figure, saying that she simply wants to help people find their own peace, even if through selfishness. I see where they're coming from, but personally I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. She's not evil in the traditional sense, but I do think the devil analogy fits quite well. After all, you know what they say about the road to hell and good intentions and all that. In a similar vein, they also take issue with the idea that Carmen and Ayan ascending into the light lets them reach a higher plane of existence, which, I'm sorry to say, but that's pretty much what is shown. Carmen can peer across all mirror worlds, and is able to influence the distortion phenomenon. That's pretty ascended to me. If it's any consolation, you can treat this more as an afterlife. Seeing as we know hell exists in some form, it's not all that big of a difference. Scruffles brings in Jungian concepts, and while I'm not super familiar with those ideas, I think it fits pretty well and there's some obvious inspiration taken. Though I warn against using such inspiration as hard fact. I've seen too many people try to shut down theories in discussion by bringing up Jungian concepts and taking them as hard rules rather than as a starting point. Fioniz and 15 Star Gamer bring up that distorting isn't completely bad, and ego isn't completely good. I'll get into this more when I talk about ego, but yeah, they lean towards one side because of their nature, definitely, but it's way more complex than just simple good or bad. Okay, there were some other cool things that people brought up, but this video is getting long, and there's a couple of big concepts I want to cover, so I'm going to talk about those directly. First up, distortion-like entities. Over the next week or so, I'm going to make a series of polls on both Discord and on YouTube posts about what counts as a distortion. Then, I'll put them together in a follow-up video sometime before the new Kanto. This will cover stuff like Blood Fiends, Pekatula, Sephira meltdowns, etc. So if you have any strong opinions on those, let me know. Next is the monoliths, and these things are crazy. We barely have any visual depictions of them, and just as few explanations on how they work, and no explanations on where the hell they come from. What we do know is that they have a multitude of functions, including making people more susceptible to distortions, taking distortions from a person and combining them with others, and more. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of rock that makes you distort. It takes a lot of the personal aspects out of distortion, mainly the fact that distortion is almost always shown as a choice. However, I am fine with this being used by rich people in the city to distort themselves for more power, as that keeps the choice-based aspects that I love so much. The buying and selling of these monoliths is a plot point I'm excited for if it goes down this direction. Finally, distortions into abnormalities. While I'll go over more detail in yet another planned video, I'll cover the basics here. While hinted at often, our only straight-up answer is in the untranslated chapters of Leviathan. Thankfully, we have fan translation, and according to them, the process occurs as such. When a distortion's reason for being is lost, and they don't get a proper resolution like some solved distortions, their sense of self is crushed, and an abnormality emerges from the distortion's body, completely obliterating the original person and replacing them with the abno. This is all we really have at the moment. I can theorize more about it later, but for now, I'm looking to wrap up this video before Christmas, so let's get back to this in a while. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm much happier with this video than if I just talked to myself for 20 minutes. Remember to check back soon for polls on what counts as a distortion, and feel free to check out the original community post, as well as my Discord, to see everyone's opinions and discussion on distortion that I couldn't quite fit into this video. Happy holidays, and I'll see you soon.